Joe Streeter reporting for Payment Expert. It is my pleasure to be joined by Craig McClure from Chargebacks 911. Craig, firstly, how are things? How are you doing?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. Good to see you.
Great stuff. And obviously, working in the industry you're in, it's been incredibly crazy time, I guess, at the moment with the digitalization of payments. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how the climate for contactless payments has changed in recent times?
Yeah, sure. I mean, contactless is like especially interesting in the context of what's going on in the industry anyway. So a lot of the growth and how we're moving essentially away from cash, right? So more online, more contactless, more digital has kind of we've put on about 4 or 5 years growth in the last 6 months just because we've had to and people have been forced to. So contactless in particular, while it was growing, pretty significantly anyway, and that's been driven by things like you can now use it to buy bus fares. So that's just like the ultimate use case: bus fares, transit, tubes. People don't need to get money to break to make small purchases. So those have been rising anyway, but now that we're in an environment where a lot of merchants are not accepting cash, they prefer card, and contactless is just the ideal technology for that. So growth is massive.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that this is the acceleration of a change and not a completely new change, if you know what I mean. The growth of contactless payments was happening anyway. This has only accelerated it. It says very much that the changes that have happened are very much here to stay, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the evidence from before indicates that when customers get comfortable with the technology and they get comfortable with the experience, and you see that differs. Young people are obviously way more savvy with the technology, whether it's using the card or the phone. But in every age group, the evidence indicates that when you activate someone to start using contactless, they start to use it more and more and more. So you get to something like, it replaces 70 to 80% of what they were doing before, chip and pin.
Yeah. And with that comes, which what sort of why we're the subject matter of why we're talking today is with that comes elevated risks and elevated threats and new threats also. I just wondered if you could sort of tell us some of the threats that have come about because of the growth of contactless payments.
Yeah, so I mean, it's probably, let's not be sort of panicking at all. I mean, the banks are pretty much on top of security, and Visa, MasterCard, and the others are on top of rules that govern how the thing is used. But I think when you look at the fact that it can be used without authentication primarily, and that we've increased the limit through the pandemic to £45 in the UK, makes it quite an attractive tool for, I guess, more opportunistic fraud. So I think about that in 2 ways. So there's opportunistic theft. So if I steal your card, it's worth something to me now rather than not being worth something to me without the PIN number. So I can use it several times probably up to that £45 limit, which when you think about what you can purchase for 45 quid and where you can do that, we're thinking like, high risk items or value items like alcohol, cigarettes, things like that. But then secondly, there is more organized fraud around intercepting cards in the post or things like that, which we see some growth in. But then there's also opportunistic fraud for customers who can make a transaction and then later claim that they lost the card. So first party fraud, we call that.
Okay, that's interesting. And in terms of the safeguards against this type of fraud, where do you feel they're gonna come from? Are they going to come from the banks, or are they going to have to come with maybe adding a bit of friction to that customer journey?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, a good rule of thumb is that everyone has responsibility for not letting fraud into the system. But I mean, obviously the banks play a bigger role than most. So the thing is not limitless. You can only use it to tap, a very small number of times before it will say, okay, wait, now I need to either speak to you, or you have to authenticate using your phone, or a one-time password through SMS, or I need you to enter the PIN number so that I can verify that who says they have the card has the card. Equally, banks are monitoring very, quite on a quite sophisticated way, the way that you're spending. So if the card pops up quite some distance from your home address, for example, and is used multiple times very quickly, or it's at an odd time of day, or at a retailer you've never used before, all these kind of odd behaviors are monitored. And if there's anything like that, someone would pop up with a text message or a call to check that it's you. So there's a bit of security in all of that.
Okay, that's interesting. And obviously, we work very much, you know, in the high risk industries within specifically the gambling industry. I wondered if there was any specific elevated threat or elevated security measures that need to be put that you feel need to be put into place in terms of high risk industries.
I mean, I think high risk industries, so, you know, I mentioned alcohol and cigarettes earlier, I would put gambling in the same category, right? So if you're attracting contactless transactions, I think some of the things that are worth watching are multiple transaction attempts, or attempts to try and split the value of a transaction to get it within the limit. So trying to get a £60 bet across 2 transactions to avoid having to enter a PIN number are good indicators that someone who shouldn't have the card has the card.
Okay, and in terms of, you know, obviously this is very much tech, and this is tech based. You know, even though it's sort of it's not elevated tech for the consumer, but is there for merchants and even for banks and for financial institutions as well? Is there a degree of financial inclusion that they need to bear in mind with this and ensure that demographics aren't, and I guess it would be the most vulnerable demographics, aren't being left behind in terms of this?
No. So there's a couple of things in that. It's quite a big question actually, Joe. But the technology is available to anyone, right? So and you probably know this as a consumer. A couple of years back, if you made a contactless transaction with your card, you wouldn't see it on your bank account until a couple of days later because it was happening sort of in behind to make it faster. Now the technology allows us to have all of those transactions happen in the full knowledge of the bank. So that means that the customers who are perhaps less financially savvy or choose not to have access to credit, so they're not running an overdraft or a big credit line on an account, can have contactless because there's no danger of them making transactions that would put them over a limit. So that makes it available to everyone. So we can give the technology to those under 18. We can use it safely with people who might be, we may not want to lend to, and it can be used safely because we can see the activity. So if there are vulnerable customers for whatever category, and there are many of them, then you've got a better control over viewing what they're spending. So there's not a lot happening without someone seeing it, which isn't Big Brother, it's just safe.
Okay, and you know, you mentioned the, you know, Big Brother there. I can see it's not Big Brother, but do you believe that will be a sort of level of friction or customer reluctance that will sort of slow the growth of contactless, or do you think people will see that it's not too intrusive?
I mean, I think I would struggle to find any evidence for it being obtrusive. I mean, the benefits to the consumer and be able to access particularly very, very small transactions easily. I used the example of bus fares. You know, I think we can all think of having to go and get a tenner out of the bank, bust it open in the shop for a packet of chewing gum to have change for the bus, and before you know it, you spent £10. Whereas contactless gives you a greater degree of control over your finances because you're spending exactly what you want to spend. In one example, I mean, I really don't see that the benefits, the convenience, when there's an understanding that there is a lot of safety behind it, the technology in the chip, the technology in the phone is even better to ensure that it is you, and there's protection across that. I mean, it's a bit of a win-win, really.
Yeah. And with you know, you mentioned the you know, the public transport industry there.
Mm-hmm.
How much will this benefit you know, industries that are looking to get back on their feet and looking to make the customer journey as efficient and smooth as possible? I think an example is I sort of spoke to somebody from the aviation industry not so long back who was, you know, he was adamant that contactless payments and a smooth payment journey is going to be key to them, I guess, recovering.
So one, I think customers now demand it, which is, you know, just a function of where we are today. But I think if you're in a situation where you're making a transaction for small value and you're being asked to enter the card into the terminal and touch the thing, you know, you're probably annoyed at that actually, which is a remarkable change in attitude from where we were a few years ago. But equally, you know, in situations like onboard purchases on an airplane, if everyone who's buying a beer or a can of Pringles on an airplane and is not using cash because that's not allowed and is not preferred, and is having to enter a PIN number, the whole thing is very slow. You know, it just adds a lot of speed and a lot of ease with, and as I said, with the security that goes with it.
With, you mentioned just before with the sort of change in how quickly contactless payments are shown on a bank statement. That was a little bit of a subtle evolution of contactless payments, but a very significant one nonetheless. As we move forward now, what do you predict will be the big changes that sort of increase engagement in contactless payments and bring it to the next level?
I mean, I think we've made a jump probably out of sequence in the limit, right? So we've moved from 30 to 45 pounds. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say the industry always had aspirations to move that limit upwards anyway. You want to be able to start to cover the average transaction value in a particular type of retailer. So, supermarkets are always a great example because they've got a mixed basket of very, very small transactions with convenience shopping, and then they've got a basket of very large transactions. Now, arguably, if you're going to spend an hour and a half going around Tesco and spend £100, then the risk of not knowing who that is probably pretty limited. But just introducing the technology in more places, so higher ticket values will do that. That's probably the next step. But with that just comes a consideration that we ensure that there are no opportunities for fraud to leak into the system.
Okay, and how do we do that? Like to ensure that the fraud can't leak, to sort of safeguard against that fraud.
So there's tons of stuff that can be done. So I mean, some of it can be quite blunt, as we said. You can only tap the card so many times, but then we can start to get more clever about understanding, for example, geolocation. So if you're using a telephone, I know where you are, I know where you typically shop, but I've got an established pattern for you. I can be pretty sure that it's you standing there with the device or with the card. So doing a lot more authentication passively in the background rather than intervening to stop you in your daily life, to stop you to check that it is you. So I'm using things I know about you to authenticate you rather than having to stop you and ask you to tell me who you are.
This it sounds like there might be a place for biometrics in here. Is that a potential, or is that not really likely at all?
No, sure. I mean, so the phone already does that. So you can make a transaction above the contactless limit using your phone, if you use face or fingerprint to authenticate the device. That we already allow that in the industry. I mean, I think, and you can find examples in there, but there are some banks who've done pilot technology with fingerprint scanners on plastic cards. That's been done. The technology exists to do that. But then, there's stories always in the media, the future of fingerprints or finger vein technology and facial rec. I mean, these things are all possible, but I think there's always a balance of how comfortable the consumer feels with that technology, how expensive it is versus the fraud you would prevent, and discussions like that. But I think the thing probably I always take comfort from is that the industry doesn't stand still with fraud. We're always looking at how we improve.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And I sort of, some of the most insightful, I get all the reading from the industry every day, and sort of some of the most insightful data that I read comes from Chargebacks, yourself at Chargebacks. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a chance to sort of tell what you do within the industry, not yourself personally, but Chargebacks, and some of the discoveries you've found, and how not just the pandemic, but how you predict this will evolve.
So I mean, our primary business in Chargebacks 911 is assisting merchants to prevent and defend from chargebacks. So chargebacks are where a customer makes a complaint about a transaction to their bank, maybe for fraud, maybe for another reason, and the bank returned the charge. Now, the rules and the way that operates is extremely complicated, but essentially we're helping the merchant to get ahead of defending himself from that threat. So having evidence, doing a better job with data, doing a better job at knowing who the customer is, to, well, one, primarily remove fraud from the system and stop them from being a victim of that in the first place, but two, ensuring that they're not taking any losses as a result of having missed opportunity. And then on the other side of our business in FI 911, we do business with larger banks, typically those who are doing business with merchants, to help them to manage that process from a risk perspective, from chargebacks, from processing operations, technology, work on that side.
Okay, and that almost felt like a nice closer, but you sort of bring me to another question there. When it comes to fighting this type of fraud, and especially with the growth of contactless, do banks work on what they do and merchants work on what they do, or do the two sort of collaborate and work together?
A political question.
Sorry.
Probably not as much as they should. So
Okay.
it tends to be a little bit of I always think of it as a little bit like Tom and Jerry, always chasing one another around the room with a big frying pan. So when the merchant gets it right, the bank's chasing the cats, and when the other side gets it right, the thing. But I mean, so both will make steps independently of one another. So you're right. There could always be more collaboration. I think you've got that right.
Yeah. That's yeah. Okay. Well, great. Thanks ever so much for your time. Really interesting discussion, and yeah, I look forward to seeing. Hopefully, we'll have to catch up again in the future. I'm sure the not too distant future, when I'm sure this industry has evolved rapidly once again.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to speak to you, Joe.
Thanks ever so much.
Thanks.